Have you ever wondered what freedom truly means? Is it simply the absence of chains, or is it something deeper, something we must learn to embrace within ourselves? Welcome to Veil Marks, the place where we bring you the most touching and meaningful stories. Stories that stay with you long after the screen fades to black. In today's video, we follow the journey of a pit bull named Bruno, a dog who spent his entire life in chains, not just the kind made of metal, but the invisible ones forged by fear and abandonment. Pit bulls are often misunderstood. Known for their strength and resilience, they are feared by many, yet beneath their powerful exterior lies unwavering loyalty and a heart capable of deep love. But what happens when a dog who has only known captivity is suddenly given the chance to be free? Before we dive in, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us reach 1,000 followers, a milestone that will allow us to create even more impactful and emotional stories for you. This story is more than just about a dog. It's about breaking the chains that hold us back, about love that heals even the deepest wounds. Stay with me until the end, because the lesson in this story might just change the way you see life. Let's begin. Bruno had never known freedom. For 10 long years, he had been shackled to the same weathered tree, its bark worn smooth where his heavy chain had rubbed against it. The chain itself was rusted and thick, its links clinking dully whenever he shifted. But movement was rare now. Bruno had long since given up pulling against it. There was nowhere to go. His world was a small, lifeless patch of dirt, carved into existence by the endless pacing of his own paws. Grass had once grown here long ago, but his presence had stripped it away, leaving only bare, hardened earth beneath him. His only possessions were a dented metal bowl that was sometimes filled with murky water and a pile of old rags that barely softened the cold ground when he lay down at night. He had learned not to expect much. His owner, if that was what you could call him, was a gruff, indifferent man who barely acknowledged Bruno's existence. Some days, he threw food onto the ground, stale scraps that Bruno gulped down before the crows could steal them. Other days, he simply forgot. Hunger gnawed at Bruno's belly often, but it was the loneliness that weighed heavier than any chain. Once, long ago, he had barked for attention. He had wagged his tail when footsteps approached, hopeful that someone, anyone, would see him. But the only responses had been a sharp kick to his ribs or a mumbled curse. So he stopped barking. He stopped hoping. The days were endless and cruel. Summer brought unbearable heat. The sun bore down mercilessly, baking the dirt beneath him until it seared his paws. There was no escape. The tree offered some shade, but it was never enough. Bruno would lie as still as possible, panting heavily, his tongue lolling from his mouth as he struggled to endure the oppressive warmth. But winter was worse. The cold seeped into his bones, stiffening his joints until every movement was agony. On the coldest nights, frost settled on his fur, turning the air into icy daggers against his skin. He curled in on himself, pressing as close to the base of the tree as he could, but there was no warmth to be found. Some nights, he wondered if he would wake up in the morning, or if this would be the night his body finally gave in. Other dogs had come and gone. Bruno had watched as younger, smaller dogs arrived, their tails wagging, their eyes filled with innocence. They never stayed long. A few days, maybe a week, and then they were gone, taken by strangers with gentle hands and soft voices. Bruno had waited for his turn. He had watched, heart hammering, whenever someone came near, silently pleading to be noticed. But no one ever chose him. He was too big, too strong, too intimidating. No one wanted a dog that looked like him. So he stayed. He stayed when the puppies left. He stayed when the man forgot to feed him for days. He stayed when the wind howled through the trees, when the rain soaked him to the bone, when the nights stretched on endlessly with nothing but silence for company. And then, The storm came. Bruno had heard storms before. He had seen the sky turn gray, felt the shift in the air before the first drops of rain fell. But this was different. The wind arrived first, howling through the trees like a wounded animal. It ripped through the yard, sending empty cans and scraps of trash skittering across the dirt. The tree groaned under the assault, its branches bending dangerously. Then came the rain. It fell in sheets, heavy and relentless, drenching Bruno's fur in an instant. He shivered, his body convulsing from the cold, but there was no escape. The dirt beneath him quickly turned to mud, thick and suffocating, swallowing his paws. He tried to move, to find even the smallest scrap of shelter, but the chain held firm. No matter how he twisted, no matter how he strained, it was always there, tight, unyielding. Then came the lightning. A jagged bolt split the sky, turning the world stark white for a fraction of a second. In that brief moment, Bruno saw something beyond the yard. An open space, a world untouched by chains. But just as quickly, darkness swallowed it again. The storm raged on, but Bruno did not fight it. He simply stood there, his head lowered, ears flattened, body trembling. There was no point in struggling. He had lived his whole life like this, bound to the ground while the rest of the world moved on. The hours stretched on. The rain pooled around him, rising until his paws were submerged in freezing water. His muscles ached. His vision blurred from exhaustion. And then a thought crept into his mind. A quiet, aching thought that refused to be ignored. If this was the end, if the storm took him tonight, would anyone care? Would anyone even notice? His gaze lifted, scanning the horizon with tired eyes. If he disappeared, would there be anyone left in the world who remembered he had ever been here at all? Walter had never been good at being alone. It had been years since his wife, Margaret, passed away, but the house still felt unbearably empty. The silence stretched across the walls, pressing against him in the late hours of the night when he sat in his worn-out armchair, staring at the same faded wallpaper they had picked out together decades ago. The only thing that had ever helped was Bailey. Bailey had been his loyal companion, a golden retriever with a heart full of love and a tail that never stopped wagging. He had been there for Walter through the hardest times, a reminder that even in loss, companionship could still exist. But Bailey had grown old, his muzzle turning gray, his once lively spirit slowing down. And one quiet morning, Bailey simply didn't wake up. Walter had buried him under the big oak tree in the backyard, right next to Margaret's favorite rose bush. And after that, the silence in the house became unbearable once more. It wasn't that Walter hadn't considered getting another dog. He had thought about it, of course. But Bailey hadn't just been a pet. He had been family. The idea of replacing him felt wrong. So Walter continued on, moving through his days with a quiet loneliness that settled into his bones like an old ache. And then he saw Bruno. It happened on a day like any other, when Walter took his usual walk down the dirt path near the outskirts of town. His joints protested with every step, but he had made it a habit, a way to keep himself moving, to keep himself from sinking too deeply into the loneliness. He hadn't planned on stopping when he passed by the old farmhouse. He never did. The place had always given him a bad feeling. There was something about the way the house sat, slumped like it was tired of standing, the yard overgrown and littered with broken things. But today, something caught his eye. A dog. A massive pit bull chained to a tree, motionless except for the slow rise and fall of his chest. His fur was slick from mud, his ribs faintly visible beneath his thick build. But it wasn't the size of the dog that made Walter stop. It was the eyes. Walter had never seen eyes like that before. Deep brown, filled with something so old and tired that Walter felt it settle in his chest like a weight. He knew that look. He had seen it in the mirror. Loneliness. "Hey, old fella," Walter murmured, stepping closer. He expected the dog to react, to growl, to bark, to do something, but Bruno didn't move. He just watched Walter with quiet, weary resignation, as if he had long since stopped expecting kindness. Walter turned toward the house. The man who lived there was exactly the kind Walter had imagined. Greasy-haired, sunken-eyed, with the kind of lazy meanness that came from never having to answer for the way he treated others. "That dog for sale?" Walter asked, keeping his voice even. The man shrugged. "You want him? He's yours. Useless thing just sits there all day." Something hot curled in Walter's stomach. Useless. Walter reached for his wallet without another word, and a few bills later, Bruno was his. Or at least, that was the plan. Walter crouched down and unlatched the rusted collar around Bruno's neck. The chain fell to the ground with a dull thud, and for the first time in 10 years, Bruno was free. But he didn't move. Walter frowned. "Come on, boy. Let's get out of here." Bruno just stared at him. It took Walter a second to understand. He wasn't refusing to move. He was afraid to. A strange kind of sadness settled over Walter then, heavier than the weight of old age. Freedom meant nothing to this dog. He had been caged for so long that he didn't know how to step beyond it. "Well," Walter sighed, rubbing the back of his neck, "guess I'm gonna have to carry you." It turned out that was easier said than done. Bruno was big. Bigger than Walter had realized, and trying to get a 100-pound pit bull into the back seat of his old truck was a battle neither of them had been prepared for. Walter tried coaxing him, but Bruno stayed rooted to the ground like he was part of it. Walter tried lifting his front paws onto the seat, but Bruno refused to budge, his muscles locking up in fear. Walter groaned, stepping back, hands on his hips. "Well, this is a hell of a situation." Bruno just blinked at him. With a sigh of resignation, Walter went for the last option, lifting Bruno himself. It was an awkward process, involving a lot of grunting and cursing under his breath. But eventually, Walter managed to heave the massive dog onto the seat. Only, now, Bruno was stuck. His back legs were still hanging out of the truck, his weight wedged so firmly between the door and the seat that he wasn't going anywhere. Walter leaned against the truck, shaking his head with a chuckle. "I swear, boy, I'm rescuing you, not taking you hostage." Bruno, for the first time, let out a small sound, something between a sigh and a low huff. Walter took it as progress. After another round of pushing, pulling, and what Walter was certain was the dog equivalent of passive resistance, they finally got Bruno all the way into the truck. Walter climbed into the driver's seat, glancing over at his new companion. Bruno was stiff, his body pressed as small as he could make it in the seat, but he was watching Walter with something new in his eyes, something uncertain, something almost like hope. Walter smiled, reaching over to pat Bruno's head. "Let's go home, boy." And for the first time in 10 years, Bruno was going somewhere that wasn't a prison. The truck ride home had been a battle in itself, but the real challenge had only just begun. Walter had spent years living alone, and now, suddenly, he had a 100-pound pit bull that didn't seem to understand the concept of being inside a house. When they finally arrived at Walter's small, cozy home, he opened the truck door, expecting Bruno to hop out. But Bruno didn't move. He just stared at the ground, his muscles locked tight, as if stepping out of the truck meant stepping into the unknown. Walter sighed, rubbing his temples. "Really, boy? We just spent 20 minutes wrestling you into this truck and now you don't want to get out?" Bruno huffed, but still didn't budge. With another sigh, Walter walked to the other side of the truck and pulled on Bruno's leash. The dog took half a step forward, hesitated, then planted his feet firmly again. Walter wasn't sure if it was stubbornness or fear, but either way, he wasn't about to spend another 20 minutes trying to lift Bruno a second time. So he did the only thing he could think of. He bribed him. Walter dug into his coat pocket, pulling out a crinkled granola bar, the only snack he had left from his morning walk. "You hungry, big guy?" He unwrapped it, breaking off a small piece and holding it out. Bruno sniffed the air, ears twitching. Walter waved it around like he was coaxing a child. "Come on now, I promise this place is better than that old tree." Bruno hesitated, then inch by inch he finally stepped out of the truck. His paws touched the ground, and he froze, glancing around nervously as if waiting for something, maybe for the chain to yank him back. But nothing happened. Walter gave him a reassuring pat on the head. "See? You're free now, bud." Bruno didn't seem convinced. Walter led him toward the front door, but when he pushed it open, Bruno tensed again. His tail dropped between his legs, his ears flattened, and he took a step backward, shaking. It took Walter a second to realize what was happening. Bruno wasn't afraid of going in. He was afraid of the door being open. Walter frowned, watching as Bruno's whole body seemed to tremble. Every time the door creaked wider, the dog lowered his head further, his eyes darting back and forth like he expected something terrible to happen. And then it clicked. Bruno thought an open door meant he was being abandoned. Walter's heart ached at the realization. How many times had this poor dog seen an open door only for it to mean someone was leaving him behind? He took a step back, giving Bruno space. "Hey now, no one's throwing you out. This is your home now." Bruno didn't seem convinced, but after a long pause, he took a hesitant step forward, then another. Walter didn't rush him. He simply waited, watching as the massive dog finally crossed the threshold. Once inside, Bruno froze again. His nose twitched as he sniffed the air, taking in the unfamiliar scent of wood and old books, the faint lingering aroma of coffee. His eyes darted around, studying everything: the worn couch, the fireplace, the small table cluttered with newspapers. And then he just stood there. Walter chuckled. "What? You don't know what to do?" Bruno blinked at him. Walter sighed, shutting the door. "All right, let's start simple." He walked over to the kitchen, opened the pantry, and grabbed a can of dog food. When he cracked it open, Bruno's ears perked slightly, his nose flaring at the smell. Walter scooped the food into a clean bowl, setting it down in front of him. Bruno hesitated again. Walter raised an eyebrow. "Really? You're scared of food now, too?" Bruno glanced up at him, then back at the bowl, as if waiting for some kind of trick. It was only when Walter took a few steps back that he finally lowered his head and took his first cautious bite. Walter watched, arms crossed. "I don't know who hurt you, boy, but I swear you don't have to live like that anymore." After finishing his meal, Bruno continued standing there, stiff and unsure. Walter walked over to the couch and patted the cushion beside him. "Come here, take a load off." Bruno just stared. Walter chuckled. "Right. You don't know what a couch is, do you?" The thought made Walter's chest tighten. 10 years, and the poor guy had never even had a soft place to rest. Deciding to give him some space, Walter went about his evening routine. He turned on the TV, flipping through the channels mindlessly, occasionally sneaking glances at Bruno, who hadn't moved an inch. He was standing in the exact same spot, watching everything, processing everything. At one point, Walter sighed, getting up to grab himself a beer from the fridge. He opened the back door to let in some fresh air. And that's when he noticed Bruno start to shake again. Walter frowned. "What's wrong now?" Bruno was staring at the open door, his whole body trembling. And then he did something that broke Walter's heart. He lowered his head, took one slow step toward the door, then stopped himself. His paws barely touched the threshold before he backed away, whimpering softly. Walter realized it then. Bruno was testing it. He was waiting to see if stepping through that door meant he was never allowed back inside. Walter sighed, shutting the door gently. "I told you, bud. You're home now. No one's kicking you out." The next few days were a slow process of unlearning fear. Walter let Bruno into the backyard, but the dog didn't know what to do with open space. He just stood there, staring at the grass like it was something foreign. Walter eventually gave up trying to coax him into moving and simply pulled up a chair, sitting down with a huff. "You seriously don't know how to walk free?" Walter muttered, shaking his head. "What, I gotta hold your leash and walk you like a baby taking his first steps?" Bruno just blinked at him. Walter sighed, stretching out his legs. "All right, suit yourself." Then, one afternoon, it happened. Bruno had been in the yard, pacing the perimeter as he always did, never venturing far from the door. Walter sat nearby, pretending not to watch. And then, by accident, Bruno took a step too far, past the invisible boundary he had placed on himself. He paused, his body stiffening, waiting for the pull of the chain that had always stopped him before. But nothing happened. Bruno blinked, confused. He took another step, then another, and then realization hit. He was free. For the first time in his life, he was truly free. Walter watched as Bruno's body tensed. Then, out of nowhere, the massive pit bull launched forward, sprinting across the yard in wide, joyful loops. His paws kicked up the dirt, his tongue lolled from his mouth, his tail wagged wildly. And then, something even more remarkable happened. Bruno smiled. It was small at first, hesitant, as if he wasn't sure he was allowed to be happy. But then, as the wind rushed past him, as he ran without restraint, the smile grew. It was the smile of a dog who had just discovered joy. Walter chuckled, shaking his head. "Well, look at that. The big guy finally figured it out." For the first time in 10 years, Bruno wasn't just surviving. He was living. The nights were different now. Bruno had spent 10 years lying alone in the cold dirt, with nothing but the rusted clinking of his chain and the hollow sounds of the wind through the trees to keep him company. He had learned that darkness meant loneliness, that silence was something to endure rather than embrace. But here, in this warm little house, things were not the same. Walter had a habit of sitting in his old armchair in the evenings, his feet propped up on a wooden stool, a cup of tea in his hand, and a worn-out blanket draped over his legs. The television murmured softly in the background, but Walter never really watched it. Instead, he would talk, to himself, to the house, to the memories that clung to the walls like old wallpaper. And now, he talked to Bruno. Bruno would lay on the floor beside Walter's chair, his large head resting on his paws, ears twitching at the familiar rhythm of the old man's voice. At first, Bruno wasn't sure what to make of it. The words didn't require anything from him. There were no commands, no demands, just a quiet, steady conversation that filled the room with something warm. Walter told stories. He spoke of Margaret, his wife, his best friend, the woman who had filled this house with laughter. He talked about how she used to hum while she cooked, how she could never remember where she put her glasses, how she had a way of making even the worst days feel bearable. His voice softened whenever he spoke about her, carrying the weight of love and loss in equal measure. And then there was Bailey. Walter's old retriever had been his shadow, following him from room to room, curling up at his feet, just as Bruno did now. "That dog," Walter would say, chuckling to himself, "was smarter than me half the time. Knew when I was sad before I did." Bruno listened. He didn't understand all the words, but he understood the feeling behind them. The way Walter's voice would catch when he spoke of the past. The way his hands would still for a moment, his gaze drifting to a space beyond the room, as if searching for something, or someone, no longer there. And for the first time in his life, Bruno felt something stir deep inside him. A connection. It wasn't like the cold, heavy chain that had bound him to that tree for years. It wasn't something forced upon him, something that restricted him. No, this was different. This was invisible, but strong, something that wrapped around him gently, something that made him feel like he wasn't alone anymore. Bruno began to change, slowly, carefully, in ways that were barely noticeable at first. He started following Walter from room to room, watching as the old man went about his daily routine. At first, it was subtle, just small, quiet movements. If Walter got up from his chair, Bruno would lift his head, watching. If Walter walked to the kitchen, Bruno would rise and take a few cautious steps, lingering in the doorway. One night, Walter shuffled toward the back door, stepping outside onto the porch to look at the stars, and when he turned around, he found Bruno standing just behind him. "Well, would you look at that?" Walter murmured. Bruno had yet to step beyond the doorframe, yet to cross that final barrier of fear that kept him tethered to his past. But the fact that he had come this far meant something. Walter gave him a small nod as if to say, "Take your time." Bruno did. At night, he no longer curled up in the farthest corner of the room, away from everything. Instead, he inched closer, little by little, until one evening, Walter woke up in his chair to find Bruno asleep beside him, his large body stretched out comfortably near the fireplace. Walter smiled. "Well, bud," he said softly, reaching down to pat Bruno's back. "Guess that means you're staying, huh?" Bruno didn't move, but his tail gave the smallest, sleepiest wag. Walter chuckled. It wasn't much, but it was something. And for the first time in a long, long while, both man and dog felt like they belonged somewhere again. The day started like any other. Walter woke up early, just as he always did, grumbling about his stiff back as he shuffled to the kitchen. Bruno followed him, as he always did, his paws clicking softly against the wooden floor. The routine had become familiar. Walter made himself a cup of coffee, spooned out Bruno's breakfast, and then they settled into their usual spots. Walter in his old armchair, Bruno lying at his feet. But something was different that morning. Bruno noticed it first. Walter moved slower than usual. His breath was heavier, his face pale. He muttered something about feeling tired, but he still went about his day, unwilling to admit that anything was wrong. Bruno watched him closely, his ears twitching at every strained sigh, every pause where Walter seemed to gather himself before continuing whatever he was doing. Then, in the quiet stillness of the afternoon, it happened. Walter had just stood up from his chair, reaching for his mug, when his body suddenly froze. His fingers went limp, and the cup slipped from his grasp, shattering against the floor. Bruno's head snapped up. Walter swayed, his hand clutching his chest, his breath coming in short, pained gasps. His knees buckled, and in the next moment, he collapsed onto the floor. Bruno was beside him in an instant. The old man's face was contorted in pain, his hand shaking as he reached toward the coffee table where his phone sat. His fingers barely grazed it before it tumbled to the ground, landing just out of reach. Walter gasped for air, his other hand pressing against his chest. His eyes flickered to Bruno, and for the first time since they had met, there was fear in them. Bruno whined, nudging Walter's arm with his nose, but the old man couldn't move. He was trapped in his own body, struggling to hold on. Panic surged through Bruno. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew it was bad. He knew that Walter wasn't getting up. He barked, loud, frantic, desperate. He pawed at Walter's shirt, nudging him again and again, as if that alone could wake him up, but nothing changed. Bruno turned his head, scanning the room, looking for something, anything that could help. His eyes landed on the door. It was open. A crack of daylight spilled in from the outside world, the wind gently nudging it wider. Bruno froze. The door was open. A chance to run. A chance to escape. But fear gripped him in an entirely different way. His whole life, an open door had meant one thing: abandonment. The last time he had stepped through an open door, it had led to nothing but pain, cold nights, hunger, and loneliness. He had learned that doors didn't lead to freedom. They led to being forgotten. His heart pounded in his chest. If he stepped through that door, would he ever come back? Would Walter still be here when he returned? The thought was unbearable. Bruno turned back to the old man, nudging him again, hoping, praying that this time he would move. But Walter's breathing was shallow now, his skin damp with sweat. Time was slipping away. Bruno let out a low, mournful whimper, his body trembling with indecision. If he left, he might never see Walter again. But if he stayed... Bruno turned to the door once more, his legs shaking as he took a single step toward it. The wind pushed it open further, revealing the vast, empty world beyond. The choice was his. And for the first time in his life, Bruno had to choose not for himself, but for the one person who had ever loved him. Bruno stood frozen, his chest rising and falling in quick, shallow breaths. The door was open, the path ahead clear, but he couldn't move. Behind him, Walter lay sprawled on the wooden floor, his breath ragged, his arm outstretched toward the fallen phone. His skin was pale, his body still. The air in the room felt heavy, thick with the quiet desperation of a life hanging in the balance. Bruno whined, nudging Walter's arm with his nose. No response. He barked, loud, frantic, but no one answered. His heart pounded in his chest as he turned back to the door. The wind pushed it open just a little more, letting in a sliver of golden afternoon light. The world outside stretched before him, open and vast. A world he had never dared to enter. His paws shifted anxiously against the floor. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to stay. An open door had never meant freedom before. It had always meant loss. Bruno had learned that lesson long ago. He had watched as others walked through open doors, disappearing forever. The last time he had stepped through one, it had led to nothing but hunger, pain, and loneliness. He had vowed never to leave safety behind again, but Walter needed him. Bruno shut his eyes, forcing himself to remember. The first time Walter had reached out to him, the gentle weight of the old man's hand resting on his head. The warmth of the fire on cold nights, the soft rumble of Walter's voice as he spoke of things Bruno didn't fully understand but could feel. Love, loss, and longing. The way Walter had looked at him, not with fear or pity, but with kindness. Walter had saved him, and now Bruno had to save Walter. A deep breath, a silent prayer. Then, with every ounce of courage he had, he ran. The moment his paws hit the ground outside, something inside him shattered, like an invisible chain snapping free. The air was crisp, alive, carrying scents he had never known. The wind rushed past his ears, the earth steady beneath his feet. But there was no time to take it in. He had to find help. Bruno sprinted down the street, his powerful legs propelling him forward, his claws scraping against the pavement. He barked, sharp and urgent, his voice echoing through the empty road. But no one came. Fear gripped him. He had never done this before, never had to navigate a world that had always been just out of reach. His entire life had been spent in confinement, watching life happen from a distance. Now he was in the middle of it, running through a world that had never belonged to him. But he couldn't stop. His chest burned, his muscles ached, but he pushed forward. He had to. A car appeared in the distance. His ears perked up. Hope surged through him. Without hesitation, he threw himself into the road, planting his feet firmly as the vehicle hurtled toward him. Tires screeched, rubber burned against asphalt. The car swerved, coming to a sudden jolting stop just inches away. Bruno didn't move. A man flung open the driver's side door, stepping out with wide, startled eyes. "What the hell?" Then he met Bruno's gaze. Something shifted. Bruno didn't look like a stray, didn't look like some lost, confused dog. He looked desperate, determined. The man hesitated, his brow furrowed. "You need help?" Bruno barked sharply, once, then turned, sprinting back the way he had come. He stopped after a few yards, looking back, waiting. The man didn't move. Bruno barked again, more insistent this time, his body tense with urgency. That's when she saw him. Across the street, a woman had stopped mid-stride, watching the scene unfold. But she wasn't looking at the man. She was looking at Bruno. Her eyes narrowed slightly, studying him, searching for something. And then something flickered across her face. Recognition, not of Bruno himself, but of what she saw in him. The panic, the raw desperation, the silent plea buried deep in his dark brown eyes. "Oh my God," she murmured, the words barely more than a breath. Then she ran. Bruno didn't wait. He turned and bolted, leading her back toward the house, pushing his body harder than he ever had before. The wind rushed past him, but he barely felt it. His focus was singular, his mind locked onto one thought: Walter. The house came into view, the door still open, swaying slightly in the breeze. Bruno reached it first, skidding to a halt just inside the threshold, his paws slipping slightly on the wooden floor. He turned back, his eyes wide with fear and hope as the woman hurried up the steps. She saw Walter immediately, her breath catching in her throat. "Oh God," she whispered, dropping to her knees beside him. Her fingers pressed against his neck, searching for a pulse. Then, without hesitation, she pulled out her phone. Bruno stood beside her, his body trembling, his chest heaving from exertion. "You did good, boy," the woman murmured, reaching out to stroke his head. "You did real good." Bruno barely heard her. His eyes remained on Walter, his body tense as he waited for any sign of movement, any sign that the man who had given him a home wasn't about to be taken away. The sirens came fast, the flashing lights reflecting off the walls. Paramedics stormed inside, taking Walter away from him. Bruno let out a low whimper, watching helplessly as they lifted him onto a stretcher, hooking him up to machines, talking in hurried voices Bruno couldn't understand. Then they were gone. The house was quiet again. The door, still open, let in the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. Bruno stepped forward hesitantly, peering out. For the first time, the open door didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning. The steady beeping of a heart monitor was the first thing Walter heard as he drifted back into consciousness. It was distant at first, muffled by the heavy fog in his mind, but slowly, as he waded through the haze, the sounds around him became clearer. The quiet murmur of nurses in the hallway, the soft hum of fluorescent lights overhead, the rhythmic whoosh of oxygen flowing through a nearby machine. And then he felt it, a weight, a warmth. It was subtle but unmistakable, the solid, reassuring presence of something pressed close to his hospital bed. Walter's eyelids fluttered open, and for a moment, he just stared at the white ceiling above him, trying to piece together what had happened. The last thing he remembered was the sharp, crushing pain in his chest, the world spinning as he reached for his phone, and then nothing. But now, he was here. Alive. And he wasn't alone. Walter turned his head, and there, lying on the floor with his chin resting on the edge of the bed, was Bruno. The big pit bull's eyes were half-lidded, his massive body curled up as tightly as it could be beside the bed. His ears twitched slightly at the sound of Walter shifting. But he didn't move, as if afraid that any sudden action would cause all of this. Walter, the hospital, everything, to disappear. Walter felt something tighten in his chest, but this time, it wasn't pain. It was something deeper, something that warmed him from the inside out. Bruno had stayed. A lump formed in Walter's throat as he slowly, carefully reached out a trembling hand. His fingers brushed against Bruno's head, and for the first time, the dog didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. Instead, Bruno leaned into his touch. Walter swallowed hard. "Hey, boy." Bruno let out a soft, almost relieved huff, his warm breath tickling Walter's arm. Walter chuckled weakly. "Guess I owe you one, huh?" There were no words that could truly capture what this moment meant. No grand declaration of gratitude, no dramatic speeches. Just a man and his dog, understanding each other in a way that required no explanation. The nurses came in and out throughout the day, adjusting machines, checking Walter's vitals, murmuring words of encouragement. They told him how lucky he was, how close it had been, and every single one of them had something to say about Bruno. "He wouldn't leave your side," one nurse said, shaking her head with a smile. "Sat right there in the waiting room, wouldn't budge. I think we all figured out pretty quickly that he belongs to you." Belongs. Walter let the words settle over him. It had been a long time since he'd felt that someone belonged to him, and he to them. A few days later, when the doctors finally gave him the all-clear to go home, Walter felt an odd mix of relief and apprehension. The hospital had been sterile and unfamiliar, but it had also been safe. The idea of going back to his empty house, after everything that had happened, sent a flicker of unease through him. But then he looked down at Bruno, sitting patiently beside his wheelchair, watching his every move with those deep, knowing eyes. And suddenly, going home didn't feel so lonely. The drive was quiet. Bruno sat in the back seat, his large frame still as he stared out the window, ears flicking at the occasional passing car. Walter caught glimpses of him in the rearview mirror, noting how different he looked compared to the first day they had met. Bruno wasn't the same dog that had cowered at open doors, that had hesitated at every step, waiting for the world to hurt him. He had changed, and so had Walter. When they finally pulled into the driveway, Walter felt a strange nervousness settle in his chest. He wasn't sure why. It was just his house, the same house he had lived in for decades. But something about returning after what had happened made it feel different. Bruno, however, seemed unbothered. Walter climbed out of the car carefully, his joints aching from the hospital bed, and walked to the front door. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before pushing it open. The house was exactly as they had left it. The coffee cup still lay shattered on the floor. The chair was still slightly pushed back from when he had collapsed. It was as if time had frozen in that moment, waiting for him to return. Walter stepped inside, then turned to look at Bruno. For a heartbeat, the dog stood at the threshold, staring at the open door. Walter held his breath. Would he hesitate? Would he freeze? But Bruno did neither. This time there was no fear, no trembling pause, no backward steps. Bruno walked inside without a moment's hesitation, his tail wagging softly, his gaze landing on Walter as if to say, "I know where I belong now." Walter let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He shut the door behind them, and just like that, the last chain, the invisible one, the one that had bound them both to their pasts, was gone. That night, Walter sat in his chair by the fire, a warm cup of tea in his hands. Bruno lay stretched out on the rug beside him, completely at ease. Walter reached down absent-mindedly, running his fingers through the dog's fur. "You know, boy," he murmured, "I think we saved each other." Bruno let out a content sigh, his eyes fluttering shut. Walter smiled. Some chains weren't made of metal, some weren't wrapped around the neck or fastened to a tree. Some were built from fear, from pain, from memories too heavy to carry alone. But sometimes, if you were lucky, you met someone who could break those chains. And sometimes, freedom wasn't about running away. It was about finding someone worth staying for. Some chains are not made of iron. They are made of fear, of past pain, of memories that whisper, "You are not worthy. You are not enough." But Bruno, he proved otherwise. Walter was saved that day, not just by Bruno's courage, but by the bond they had built, a bond that neither time nor hardship could break. When the doors of Walter's house opened again, there was no hesitation, no fear. Bruno stepped inside, because for the first time in his life he knew where he belonged. There's a lesson in this for all of us. The past may chain us down, whispering doubts in the back of our minds, keeping us from stepping through the open doors in our own lives. But real freedom? Real freedom is choosing to trust, to love, and to believe that we are not alone. Nelson Mandela once said, "I learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it." Bruno found his courage, not in running away, but in staying. And you? What are the chains holding you back? If this story touched your heart, leave a comment below. Have you ever had a pet that changed your life? Have you ever faced a moment where stepping forward felt impossible? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Veil Marks for more heartwarming, thought-provoking stories. Your support means the world. It fuels this journey of storytelling, one story at a time. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the bravest thing we can do is open the door and walk through.